Thank you. Good morning. Climate change is the challenge facing humanity today. Experts are raising the alarm about this crisis with increasing anxiety. Clearly, we need urgent action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in order to limit the global temperature rise over the coming years. But what about the many people that are experiencing the impacts of climate change now, today, and those who will experience worsening impacts for the foreseeable future? For the first time in 2015, the Paris Agreement under the United Nations Convention on Climate Change established a global goal for adaptation. This was a recognition that we are committed to a certain amount of climate change and that investment in adaptation to manage the impacts is both necessary and increasingly urgent. Climate change is inherently a justice issue. Those who have contributed least to its causes will suffer most from its effects. At the global level, such as in the Paris Agreement, this is already recognized. This agreement, ratified by 185 countries, makes the links between climate change and human rights, poverty eradication, and sustainable development. It also acknowledges the importance of gender equality and women's empowerment and calls for climate action to be gender responsive. So how do these commitments play out in practice? How do we ensure that efforts to respond to this unprecedented challenge eliminate rather than exacerbating inequalities? At the International Institute for Sustainable Development, we are increasingly focused on the gender implications of sustainable development policies and investments. Among other projects, we work with governments to promote planning for climate change adaptation that is gender responsive. This comes down to three things: who matters, who decides, and who benefits. The right answer to all of these questions is, of course, everyone. Everyone matters when it comes to managing the impacts of climate change, particularly those who are least able to adapt. Everyone should have a say in how climate action unfolds, and everyone should benefit from investments in adaptation in an equitable manner. But when we're thinking about who matters, we need to recognize that people experience the impacts of climate change in different ways. A livestock herder in the lowlands of Ethiopia has a different experience with climate change than a civil servant working in Addis Ababa. A commercial farmer has a different experience with climate change than a smallholder growing food crops for their family. A woman in a poor rural household has a different experience with climate change than her husband. What this means is that people have different adaptation needs depending on where they live, how they sustain their livelihoods, and the roles that they play in their families and communities. There are socially determined differences too, in responsibilities, opportunities, and decision-making power, and all of these influence how vulnerable people are to climate change. Without understanding these dynamics, which are often influenced by gender, there is a risk that the people with the greatest need for adaptation will be left out. Adaptation is effective when it considers the differing needs of women and men, as well as marginalized groups, to ensure that investments are targeted where they are needed most. The reality is, in many countries, women remain underrepresented in decision-making in areas relevant to climate change adaptation. For example, in many African countries, the number of women in senior positions in government is concerningly small. And at the household level, decision-making often still rests with men. If women aren't involved in decision-making, how likely is it that their interests will be represented? Effective adaptation brings everyone to the table, recognizing the value of their knowledge and their potential as agents of change. The process of planning for climate change adaptation is designed to make it possible to invest in concrete actions that reduce vulnerability to climate change. However, there is a risk that these actions actually reinforce the existing wealth and power structures rather than benefiting the most vulnerable women, men, boys, and girls. Adaptation is effective when it is equitable, providing opportunities and benefits for all people. The urgency of adapting to climate change has never been clearer. We have an opportunity with global commitments like the Paris Agreement to rapidly scale up action in this area. For this to be effective, we need to start from the premise that everyone matters, rich or poor, farmer or civil servant, woman or man. We need to bring diverse voices into decision-making, including those that are typically excluded, in order to identify the best solutions for adapting to climate change. And we need to ensure that investments in adaptation yield equitable benefits for people of all genders and social groups. This is the only way that we can build families, communities, and societies that are resilient to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angie. So do you see girls and women as potentially, and of course this is a trick question because you all know who I'm thinking about, as maybe the new wave of advocates to combat climate change?
I do know who you're thinking about. And I think it's been extremely encouraging to see this movement that has been led by a young woman and that has swept the globe. And I find that one of the most optimistic things that I've seen in recent years in relation to this sometimes terribly depressing challenge of confronting climate change.
Yes, it is encouraging. It's and in a way, as an adult, it's also a bit sad is maybe not the right word, but you wish that young people didn't have to be this scared. They are, and they want us to be scared as well and to take action. So in your line of work going forward, how will you use your power for good?
I will use my power to convince policymakers that adaptation is not effective unless it addresses gender inequality. I will try to move the conversation about addressing the impacts of climate change on from technologies and infrastructure to inclusion, social change, and resilience for all.
Thank you.
Thank
and
you.
Thanks so much for coming to us today, to this Power Stage.